Aristotle's solution to the puzzle about coming to be that he inherited from Parmenides and Zeno of Elea, and his account of what the principles of nature are comes in book 1, chapter 7 of the Physics. And it can be a little bit difficult to see what exactly he thinks the principles of nature are because he uses an example that is not an example of a natural change. It's an example of what Aristotle also would call an accidental change. His example is of this unmusical man, or a man who comes to be musical. What he's going to do is look at this change, this generation, this thing that comes to be, and he's going to draw out certain principles of this particular change, but principles which must apply to any change, right? The unmusical man coming to be musical is supposed to be an illustration of how change in general works, of how coming to be or generation in general works. And what it's going to reveal are certain principles that need to be present in any change. And these principles are the principles of nature. Okay, so let's see how it works. So his example, so the unmusical man comes to be musical. What he has in mind here is someone, who doesn't know how to play guitar or piano or whatever, and then learns how to play guitar or piano or whatever, right? Somebody who's ignorant of music, but then learns it, right? Goes to the piano teacher and learns how to play piano. Something like that. That's a change. That's a coming to be. Right? Okay. So there is our man, and he is unmusical, right? The music note is crossed out. And the change we're going to be considering is this person, this man comes to be musical. They learn music. They go to a teacher and they learn music. Okay. Aristotle says there are three ways of describing one and the same change. This one change that happened, there are three ways of describing it. We could say the man comes to be musical. We could say that what is not musical comes to be musical, right? So the man comes to be musical, that's obvious. What is not musical comes to be musical. Well, look, the man is not musical, and then he comes to be musical. And so what is not musical, namely that guy, comes to be musical, learns music. And then lastly, we could say that the unmusical man comes to be a musical man. Those are the three ways of describing this change. And the reason Aristotle goes into these three different ways of describing this change, we're not going to get into the details of it, but the main reason he does this is because he thinks that when you start looking at those three ways and trying to understand how exactly they work and what exactly they're describing and what exactly they're getting at, what they bring to our attention are three key items. And these are going to be key items for any kind of change, but we'll look at them just with regard to this musical case. All of these ways of describing this change, while they don't all mention all three items, all three items are essential for making sense of each way of describing this one change. And some of these ways of describing this change highlight some of these items while ignoring others. But really, even to make them intelligible to make any one of these three ways of describing this change intelligible, all three of these items need to be present. So on the one hand, there's the man. The man is not mentioned in number 2, but when you try to make sense of number 2, what is not musical, you're going to be making reference to the man. What is not musical, that's just another way of talking about that man, at the beginning at least, right? And so even though the man doesn't show up there, he's kind of implicitly there. That's one of the key items. Another one is the not musical. The not musical is highlighted in number 2, but it doesn't show up at all in number 1. But nonetheless, if you think about number 1, the man comes to be musical. He couldn't come to be musical if he couldn't learn how to play piano if he already knew how to play piano. He couldn't come to have learned how to play piano if he already knew how to play piano. And so number 1, while it doesn't mention the quote not musical, it's kind of implied, right? The man mentioned in number 1, it's implied that that man is not musical because that man comes to be musical. And then lastly, the musical, right? That's the third key item, and that shows up in all of them. Aristotle's idea is that in order to make this change intelligible, and in any change that happens, you're going to have 3 items like this. And what he's going to do now is use these items, use this specific change as an illustration of change in general. And so when we kind of generalize from this case, or we use this case as an illustration of how change in general works, we're not going to talk about the man, the not musical, and the musical. We're going to talk in more general terms about subject, privation, and form. So the man is the subject of this change. The not musical is the privation. It's a lacking of musicality, right? It's the not being of musicality, to sound very pretentious and abstract. The privation. And then you have what Aristotle calls the form. It's the relevant property or feature in question. The thing, the feature or property that results from the change. Now, what Aristotle wants to say, and kind of his move, previous thinkers like Parmenides and Zeno, and then other people had these puzzles about coming to be. They got confused about these 3 elements, and they didn't see the fact that those first 2 items, the subject and the privation, are this is the way Aristotle puts it. They are numerically one. And he identifies them with matter. The subject and the privation refer to the matter, or as Aristotle also calls it, the underlying thing. And Aristotle is not as careful as you might like him to be using his terminology. And so often enough, he'll interchange subject, matter, and underlying thing. He's usually much more careful about privation. But what does he mean by saying that subject and privation are numerically one? What he means is that at the beginning of this change, the guy over on the left, you just have one thing there. You have numerically one thing, namely that guy, right? Nonetheless, we can think of that guy in 2 different ways. We can think of him as the subject, as simply the man, or we can think of his lack of musicality. And so what Aristotle says is because we can think of him in 2 ways, even though he's one thing, he is 1 numerically, but 2 in form. Think of it this way. His use of form there can be misleading. He's 1 numerically, but there are 2 different ways you can look at him. You can look at him just in as much as he's the guy there, the subject, or you can look at him in as much as he's lacking the relevant form. He's lacking musicality. But that's one thing there. That's the matter. And what Aristotle wants to say is that one aspect of the matter, the subject, underlies the entire change. You have the man at the beginning of the change, you have the man at the end of the change, you have the man in the middle of the change. The man is always there. He's there at the beginning, he's there at the end. The subject is there at the beginning and there at the end. The matter is there at the beginning and there at the end. But the privation is not. The privation does not survive the change. And so at the beginning of the change, the subject is characterized by the privation, but in the course of the change, the subject loses the privation and acquires the opposite of the privation, namely the form. And indeed, in Aristotle's view, that's exactly what a change is. It's when a subject initially lacks some feature and then comes to acquire it. And in his view, previous thinkers had overlooked these three items of the change in different ways, depending upon the thinker. But what he would say is that what focusing on these three key items reveals to us is that there is a sense in which generation does indeed come from what is not. And there's a sense in which generation or coming to be comes from what is. And what's important to make coming to be or generation intelligible is to understand the particular senses in which coming to be proceeds from what is and from what is not. So, yes, coming to be proceeds from what is. How so? What came to be? A musical man. The musical man came to be from the man. The man existed. He continued to exist throughout the change, and he exists at the end. And the man exists, and so generation arises from what is. But wait, doesn't that just mean then there's no real change? No, Aristotle would say. Because the man did not initially have the form. The form comes to inhere in the man. And so the musical man is genuinely generated, and it's generated from what is. Right? And so there's no great puzzle there. But also, coming to be arises from what is not, Aristotle would say. But you have to understand how exactly. It arises from a privation. It wouldn't make sense to say that the man becomes musical if he wasn't initially not musical. If there wasn't initially a lack, if there wasn't initially some sense of the change arising from what is not. This particular change arises from what is not musical. Right? So all three elements have to be in place. And what people like Parmenides would do is they'd forget about certain of the elements when they were making their arguments, or forget about. They weren't sensitive to certain of these elements. And so, yes, change arises from what is not. It arises from a privation. But that's not all that there is at the beginning of the change. That's kind of what Parmenides had assumed. That's what led him to think that change couldn't arise from what is not. Yeah, there's a privation, but there's also the subject, and the subject is. Change can arise from being. Parmenides thought you wouldn't have genuine change if that was how change worked, if that's how coming to be worked. Well, no, Aristotle would say. You're overlooking the privation in form in that case. Because that subject, what is, initially does not have the form and then comes to acquire it. And so that form genuinely kind of comes to be in the man. And so you have a case of genuine generation from what is. This is how Aristotle solves the puzzle about coming to be. And he thinks this solution points out the principles of nature. And those principles are matter and form.